Okay, sorry, Benny. I just saw that you commented on a video about 3 weeks ago. So here's my reply. I get a lot of notifications. You know how YouTube is, other channels and stuff. So I just flip through. I guess 3 weeks is better than a year too. So let's give some background to it. Also, you say just started watching your videos recently. You mentioned that despite having lived in Japan for a number of years and being married to a local, you felt that you'll never become Japanese. Japanese in quotes. I've heard about this from others who have lived in Japan for some years. Could you please elaborate on that feeling? Is it the discrimination, or that there's so much to learn in the country that you feel like you will never integrate completely, or the language barrier? Thanks. From Canada. Okay, yeah, really good question. Basically, it's the discrimination, to cut to the chase. And um, I'm not saying that it's this overly conscious discrimination. Sometimes it is. Um, but the Japanese historically have a very strong historical trend of isolationism, xenophobia, and this kind of bizarre um, self-propagating belief in being special. And some people here, they realize it's kind of ridiculous. Other people do not really believe it. Um, there's a lot of also in between. But really, the language barrier, as you ask, is also a pretty strong factor, especially because Japanese is just essentially just such a weird language. It's very much kind of on its own linguistically, and so much to learn in the country. Yeah, learning to read, learning the culture, how to behave in the culture, does take a lot of time. It's a very defined culture, and it's immediately clear to people if you're not used to it. Japanese conditioning starts at a really young age. I've worked in a elementary school before, and I'm raising my kids here. I can see just how strong the trend is from earliest childhood to adulthood to like Japanify people's minds. Um, so that's also another factor. If you're not born here and raised here, you lack that conditioning, and people just kind of sense that you're not from here. Normally in other countries, that's no big deal. In Japan, it is a big deal because it's Japan and everyone's Japanese, and they're used to this homogeneity, I think is the word, this uniform quality to people's behavior and speaking, and of course their appearance. Everyone looks Japanese, so that's another thing. I've one thing I saw years ago was a young boy whose mother was Russian. She worked in a bar, as they call them hostesses. Maybe you're familiar with that. It's kind of this weird niche market where um, salarymen slash lonely guys can go and speak with usually pretty good looking girls. They pay a bunch of money for the drinks, and all of the staff are women, and they'll come keep you company and talk to you. And um, sometimes it can go from there and develop into kind of a relationship, friends with benefits, so to speak, or etc. But so this woman had a child, um, and the father wasn't around, and the boy was born and raised here in Japan, but looks Russian. The genes just, and so it was really kind of hard for me to see because he didn't know really his own language or his own culture. He didn't really look Japanese, and so he was just like kind of a double whammy. Any other country in the world, it would have been, wow, I'm assuming it would have been like, yeah, no problem. But here in Japan, um, basically, if you're just not Japanese, you're not Japanese, and you never will be because you don't look Japanese. You don't have the socio-cultural conditioning, and the conditioning you do have, like we're all conditioned by our culture. Westerners, I'm noticing, almost universally have just this stronger sense of individual identity, and a lot of times like much sharper creative and analytical abilities. than the average Japanese person. Somebody out there might really hate that I just said that, but in my observation, it's been true. Japanese people are really like encouraged to not think about things or analyze things or ask questions, and you can see that. I've seen that so many times in teaching English. Any questions? Dead silence, unless it's a private lesson with an adult. So my point there is there's the aspect of not being conditioned by Japanese culture, compounded by another aspect of being conditioned by your own culture, which makes you really, really stick out. And people basically don't know how to process it. They can get uncomfortable with it. They don't know how to behave. They'll get really weird and just like fall back into this kind of like almost like this school-aged boy type of behavior where you're just kind of like, all right, screw it, you know. I've had that happen a few times where it's just like, what, no. And, so it's something you have to learn to deal with. It's not universally the case, but in my my limited experience, the people here in Japan who don't have that typical facade have almost always been people who spent time abroad, a year or two or more, and have kind of absorbed culture from outside the country. Barring that, you're pretty much dealing with just this incredibly deep cultural conditioning, and somewhere in there is the actual human being, but they're kind of leery of letting you see that, and it's hard to explain, but basically the psychology of Japanese people is unique to Japan. And then on top of that, there's also the physical appearance of people here, and the language itself, and then the commonality of having been raised in this very unified education system. You can feel it. And like you ask, you mention, there's so much to learn in the country. Yeah, essentially that's what that boils down to. And of course a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And then there's also the question of, well, is it really worth it? You know, do you want to spend years, you know, learning how to come off as Japanese, right? Even like in my case, I don't look Japanese, so I'm going to have to convince people every single time. And so it's just weird. You know, it's a weird situation to have to deal with. And which is why a lot of people just kind of say like, yeah, no, and just kind of carve out their own, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of bubble here. And it's not universally the case. There are unique, interesting people here. You know, it's possible for foreign men to have Japanese friends, but it's not as common as back home. Like when I was living in the States, I had friends of all different nationalities, races, sexual preferences, you know. I just thought it was normal. And I brought that over here to Japan with me, and I realized, like, dude, no, you were very much in an exceptionally, like, liberal, open environment where people were creative and analytical and kind of focused on improving things and breaking things down and creating things, you know. So I hope that answers your question. Feel free to ask any more. I mentioned the discrimination, and it's not in the sense of being like conscious discrimination, where if you really analyze what discrimination means, it really means the ability to tell the difference between things, right? So you can discriminate between black and white. You know what's white and what's black. But there's another level to that where people use that difference as a basis to treat people differently. And sometimes it's just reactionary. You're like, oh, they don't know what to do. Like, I've literally seen like a whole room full of people like clam up when I walk in the room, like that, because they don't know what to do. they're not necessarily angry, oh my god, it's a foreigner, they don't want to kill me or anything, but they literally don't know what to do. They've sensed the difference. Other times people can be really aggressive. There is an issue here with racial, you know, racially motivated, hateful discrimination, and there's also just a lot of ignorance. They simply don't know how to process things. I've mentioned racism in Japan in another video. At the time, I don't know, perspectives change, but I would say now that yes, racism is a problem here, but like anywhere else in the world, it's mostly coming from basically very stupid, oftentimes undereducated people with very, very little experience outside their little bubble, or really anything to do in their life with meaning. So that's pretty universal, but it's much more pronounced here because you know, it's Japan, so you stand out a lot. So yeah, discrimination is the root cause, but not in the sense of it being this kind of like segregation, like what was back in the United States. But it is there, and it is something I think eventually Japanese society as a whole is going to have to address because, frankly speaking, it's hard for me to imagine Japan surviving as it is indefinitely. You know, decreasing population, um, shifting power scene in the world, the rise of China being part of that. There's just going to come a time where Japan is going to have to be competitive and competent in a way that doesn't rely on American protection and 4 or 5 big companies. They've been able to get away with that because of that same super deep cultural conditioning where people are happy to just occupy their spot and feed into the greater part of the nation. But I think that's probably going to change because economically the country has peaked and it's going to require a totally different approach. They won't be able to get away with just relying on big companies selling gadgets to America. There's going to have to be a lot more competitive innovation and kind of smarter business practices internally in companies, and that's going to require the culture itself to change. If you've ever worked for a Japanese company, the last thing they are is like efficient and innovative. Surprisingly. I don't know what it is. It's one of those weird things where that what they do and what they sell, they do and sell extremely well, but behind the scenes, the process is often really overly complex and very stifled because of the cultural conditioning. That's a whole another subject unto itself, but it's very, very reflective of just kind of the general notion of control in this country. Control and obedience. And people pick up on that. If you haven't grown up in that, they know right away. They're just like, they don't know what to do, they're afraid of losing face, they treat you differently, it gets really awkward and weird, and it turns a lot of people off. Some people pop their top and go home, never to return, just because, just on a social level, it can be so bizarre. So, there it is. I hope that answers your question. I could keep going probably for another hour, because it's just something I deal with so much. But yeah, thanks again, Benny, for the question, and feel free to comment anytime. Okay, so I'll try to tag you, I'll reply to you and just let you know I put a video up about it. Alright, until next time, bye-bye.